Sometimes the person waiting outside your door is carrying the answer to a question you have never dared to ask. Long before the first rays of sunlight reached the quiet streets of Beacon Hill, Boston rested beneath a pale winter sky. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks with a soft white blanket, muffling every sound except the occasional whisper of the wind moving through bare tree branches. Ethan Carter, a 45-year-old white millionaire CEO, returned home later than usual after spending another exhausting night reviewing plans for an international business expansion. Success had filled his calendar, his bank accounts, and every room inside his elegant townhouse, yet it had quietly emptied his evenings of everything that could not be measured on a financial report. As he climbed the final stone steps leading toward his front door, he noticed something unusual resting against the old brass railing. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a pile of blankets left behind by accident. Then he heard the slow, peaceful rhythm of someone breathing. Ethan immediately stopped walking. The porch light cast a gentle glow across the small figure curled up on the welcome mat. It was a little girl, no older than 8 years old, sleeping with remarkable calm despite the freezing morning air. She wore a pale blue winter coat that had clearly been repaired several times, a cream knitted hat pulled low over soft blonde hair, and white mittens wrapped protectively around a weathered wooden box resting against her chest. Beside her lay a faded backpack with worn straps that had been carefully stitched together instead of replaced. Snowflakes rested lightly upon the shoulders of her coat, but someone had tucked the edges of a thin blanket carefully around her before the night grew colder. Ethan looked around the quiet street. No parents. No neighbors. No parked car waiting nearby. Only silence and softly falling snow. His first instinct was concern rather than confusion. He quietly unlocked the front door but did not step inside. Instead, he removed his own wool overcoat and gently placed it across the little girl's shoulders without waking her. The added warmth caused her to stir slightly. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the old wooden box as though protecting the most valuable thing she owned. Ethan knelt beside her, careful not to frighten her. "Hello," he said softly. "You are safe. Can you hear me?" The little girl slowly opened her bright blue eyes. For a brief moment, she looked directly at him without fear, surprise, or uncertainty. It was almost as though she had expected this exact moment all along. She sat up carefully, still holding the wooden box against her heart. Ethan noticed that although she looked tired, her expression remained peaceful. She was not shivering. She was not crying. She simply looked relieved. "Good morning," Ethan said gently. "My name is Ethan. Are you all right?" The little girl gave a small nod before looking at the front door behind him. "I have been waiting," she whispered. Ethan glanced once more along the empty street before returning his attention to her. "Waiting for who?" She looked back into his eyes with quiet certainty that seemed far beyond her years. "For you." Ethan frowned with gentle confusion. "Do we know each other?" The little girl slowly shook her head. "Not yet." She carefully brushed a few snowflakes from the top of the wooden box before continuing in the same calm voice. "My dad told me that if life ever became too heavy for me to carry alone, I should come to this house and wait until Mr. Carter came home." Ethan felt a strange stillness settle over the cold winter morning. He searched her face, hoping some forgotten memory might suddenly return, but nothing did. He had never seen the little girl before. Yet she had somehow found his home, trusted his name, and spent the entire night sleeping outside his door with nothing except an old wooden box, a faded backpack, and a promise that someone she loved had asked her to keep. The little girl's quiet words lingered in the cold morning air as Ethan Carter remained kneeling beside her on the snow-covered porch. Nothing about the moment made sense, yet nothing about the child suggested danger or deception. She held the weathered wooden box with both hands as though it contained something far more precious than its worn appearance revealed. Ethan noticed the careful way she protected it whenever she shifted her weight, almost instinctively placing it between herself and the world. You must be freezing, he said gently. Please come inside. The little girl hesitated for only a second before nodding politely. Ethan opened the front door wider, allowing the warmth from the fireplace to spill across the front steps. She quietly removed her snow-covered boots on the entry rug without being asked, carefully placed her faded backpack beside them, and carried the wooden box inside with both hands. Ethan guided her toward the living room where the fire crackled softly beneath an old stone mantel. The elegant townhouse felt unusually peaceful that morning. Shelves lined with books, family photographs from years long past, and large windows overlooking the snowy street surrounded them with quiet comfort instead of luxury. Ethan disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with a thick wool blanket draped across one arm and a steaming mug of hot chocolate resting on a small tray. The rich aroma of cocoa filled the room as he placed the mug carefully onto the coffee table. This should help you warm up, he said with a reassuring smile. The little girl wrapped the blanket around her shoulders before accepting the mug with both hands. She whispered a soft thank you, then waited several moments before taking her first careful sip. Ethan noticed that even while holding the warm cup, one hand never drifted far from the wooden box resting on her lap. Curiosity grew stronger, but he resisted asking too many questions too quickly. Instead, he sat across from her in a comfortable armchair, allowing silence to become a sign of safety rather than pressure. Outside, gentle snow continued falling across Beacon Hill while the first hints of dawn slowly brightened the sky beyond the windows. "What is your name?" Ethan finally asked. The little girl looked up with calm blue eyes. "Lily Harper." Ethan smiled warmly. "It is nice to meet you, Lily." She returned the smile, small but genuine. "My dad always said you would be kind." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Your father knew me?" Lily nodded. "He worked here a long time ago." Ethan searched his memory. Over the years, landscapers, contractors, delivery drivers, and maintenance crews had cared for the property. Faces came back in fragments, but no clear memory appeared. Lily seemed to understand the uncertainty on his face. "He took care of your garden," she explained softly. "He loved every flower, every tree, and every path behind this house." Ethan looked toward the frost-covered backyard visible through the tall windows. The garden had remained beautiful for years, though lately he had hardly found time to walk through it. "Your father told you to come here?" he asked quietly. Lily lowered her eyes to the wooden box. "Before he became very sick, he told me that if I ever felt completely alone, I should bring this box to Mr. Carter because he would know what to do." Ethan looked at the carefully worn wood, noticing tiny carved leaves decorating its edges. Time had softened every corner, but someone had protected it with extraordinary care. "May I ask what is inside?" Lily gently shook her head. "Dad said it should stay closed until the right moment." Ethan accepted the answer without hesitation. Instead of feeling frustrated, he sensed that the little wooden box carried not only memories but also a promise waiting for its proper time. As the morning light slowly filled the room, Ethan realized that his carefully planned day had quietly disappeared before it had even begun, replaced by something far more important than any meeting waiting on his calendar. The fire continued burning softly while winter sunlight slowly brightened the snow-covered garden beyond the tall windows. Ethan Carter quietly canceled every meeting on his morning calendar with a single phone call to his assistant. For the first time in years, an unexpected visitor mattered more than the carefully organized schedule that usually controlled every hour of his day. When he returned to the living room, Lily Harper was still sitting exactly where he had left her. The warm blanket rested comfortably around her shoulders, the empty mug of hot chocolate sat neatly on the coffee table, and the weathered wooden box remained safely on her lap with both hands resting gently upon it. Ethan noticed that although she had become more relaxed inside the warmth of the house, she never allowed the box to leave her side for even a moment. He smiled kindly before taking the armchair across from her once again. "Your father must have trusted this place very much," he said softly. Lily nodded without hesitation. "He trusted you." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. I wish I remembered him better. Lily looked toward the large windows facing the backyard. He never expected you to remember everything, she replied. He only hoped you would remember what mattered. Ethan followed her gaze. Beyond the glass stood the quiet winter garden stretching behind the townhouse. Snow rested gently across winding stone paths, sleeping flower beds, and rows of carefully trimmed hedges. Even beneath the cold season, the garden still carried a quiet beauty that spoke of years of patient care. Would you like to see it? Ethan asked. Lily smiled for the first time since entering the house. Dad loved that garden more than anywhere else. They dressed warmly before stepping outside through the rear door. Fresh snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they walked slowly along the familiar stone path. Ethan realized how long it had been since he had wandered through the property without thinking about business calls or upcoming meetings. Lily moved carefully from one section of the garden to another, quietly recognizing places that no longer looked exactly the same. She stopped beside a large maple tree whose bare branches reached toward the pale winter sky. Dad planted this tree, she whispered proudly. Ethan looked closely at the thick trunk before noticing a small brass plaque partly hidden beneath fresh snow. Kneeling down, he brushed the snow away with his gloved hand. The engraving had faded with time but remained readable. It simply said, "Planted with gratitude." Ethan stared at the words in thoughtful silence. Lily gently touched the rough bark with her mitten. Dad always said trees remember kindness because they keep growing long after people stop watching them. They continued walking until they reached an old wooden bench overlooking the center of the garden. Time had weathered the wood, but someone had carefully repaired each worn board instead of replacing it. Lily smiled again. He built this bench too. Ethan slowly sat beside her, looking across the peaceful landscape that had quietly surrounded his home for years without truly capturing his attention. Your father left many beautiful things here, he said. Lily shook her head gently. He said flowers, benches, and trees never really belong to the person who plants them. They belong to everyone who finds peace because they exist. Ethan remained silent, allowing the simple wisdom to settle deeply inside him. Then Lily carefully lifted the weathered wooden box onto the bench between them. She rested one hand on its carved lid before looking at Ethan with complete trust. Dad also said that before we opened this box together, you needed to remember the garden first. Ethan looked from the quiet winter landscape to the little girl sitting beside him and slowly realized that the true key to the box had never been hidden inside the wood at all. It had been growing patiently in his own forgotten heart, waiting for someone gentle enough to help him find it again. Snow continued falling gently across the quiet garden as Ethan Carter and Lily Harper remained seated on the weathered wooden bench beneath the great maple tree. Neither of them reached for the carved wooden box resting between them. The silence felt comfortable, almost respectful, as though the garden itself remembered the man who had once cared for every flower and branch with patient hands. Ethan looked around more carefully than he ever had before. Beneath the blanket of fresh snow, he noticed small wooden markers placed beside several flower beds. Their paint had faded through the years, yet each one had been carved by hand instead of purchased from a store. Lily followed his eyes and smiled softly. Dad made every one of those. Ethan stood and slowly walked toward the nearest marker. Brushing away the snow with his gloved hand, he read a simple inscription burned into the wood. It said, "Hope grows quietly." He moved to another marker several feet away. This one read, "Kindness needs daily care." A third simply said, "Leave beauty behind you." Ethan felt a quiet ache in his heart. He had walked through this garden hundreds of times without ever slowing down long enough to notice the messages hidden among the flowers. Lily joined him beside the final marker and gently touched the weathered wood. Dad said gardens teach people how to become better without using many words. Ethan smiled with thoughtful admiration. Your father sounds like someone who understood life very well. Lily nodded. He believed flowers bloom because someone cared for them long before anyone could see the results. They continued walking through the snow-covered paths until they reached a small stone fountain standing silent beneath the winter sky. Around its circular edge, several evergreen shrubs remained bright despite the cold season. Ethan suddenly remembered something. "I used to see your father here early in the mornings." Lily looked up. "Really?" Ethan smiled. "He always arrived before sunrise. Sometimes I would leave for the office while he was trimming hedges or planting flowers." He paused as another memory slowly returned. "Every time I thanked him, he answered exactly the same way." Lily's eyes brightened. "He always said, 'The garden thanks both of us.'" Ethan laughed quietly, surprised that he could suddenly hear the gardener's warm voice so clearly after all those years. "I had forgotten that." Lily looked toward the wooden box still resting safely on the bench across the garden. "Dad never forgot you either." They returned to the bench together. The carved box remained untouched, tiny snowflakes resting gently across its lid before melting into small drops of water. Ethan carefully wiped the moisture away with his scarf, treating the box with the same respect Lily had shown since arriving. She watched him with peaceful satisfaction before speaking. "Dad told me that people reveal who they really are by the way they care for things that cannot repay them." Ethan slowly nodded as the words settled deeply inside him. He realized that the little wooden box had quietly become more than an object waiting to be opened. It had become a mirror reflecting every choice he made from the moment he found Lily sleeping outside his front door. The morning had begun with concern for a stranger. It had become a journey through forgotten memories. Now, surrounded by silent trees and sleeping flowers, Ethan understood that every step had been leading towards something far greater than curiosity. Lily gently placed both hands upon the carved lid and looked at him with complete trust. "Dad said that once you remembered the garden, you would also remember how to protect what truly matters." Ethan looked across the peaceful landscape stretching behind his home and quietly wondered whether the greatest thing waiting inside the wooden box was not a letter or a keepsake, but the chance to become the man someone else had always believed he could be. The quiet garden seemed to hold its breath as Lily Harper slowly lifted the weathered wooden box onto her lap. Ethan Carter remained beside her on the old bench beneath the maple tree, saying nothing. He sensed that whatever had been protected inside for so many years deserved patience instead of curiosity. Lily traced her fingertips along the carved leaves decorating the lid before carefully reaching into the pocket of her pale blue winter coat. From inside, she removed a tiny brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon had grown soft with age, but it had been tied neatly, as though someone had wanted it to remain beautiful for as long as possible. She placed the key into the small lock and looked toward Ethan. "Dad said I should never open it alone," she whispered. Ethan nodded gently. "Then we will open it together." The tiny lock clicked softly. Lily slowly raised the lid. Inside, everything had been arranged with remarkable care. Resting on top was a cream-colored envelope with Ethan Carter's name written neatly across the front in dark blue ink. Beneath the envelope lay an old pair of brown leather gardening gloves, their fingertips worn smooth from years of honest work. Beside them rested several small paper packets tied together with twine. Ethan carefully lifted one packet and read the handwritten label. "White lilies." Another packet read, "Blue hydrangeas." A third simply said, "Hope Garden." At the bottom of the box rested a small framed photograph. Ethan picked it up with both hands. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside a smiling gardener beneath the very same maple tree where they now sat. Both men held freshly planted saplings while dirt covered their gloves. Ethan stared silently at the image before a forgotten memory returned with surprising clarity. Years earlier, after purchasing the townhouse, he had visited the garden one Saturday morning. The gardener had convinced him to plant the maple tree with his own hands instead of hiring someone else to do it. Ethan remembered laughing after dropping his expensive watch into the soil. The gardener had laughed with him before saying, "The best things we grow never stay perfectly clean." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the familiar voice once again. "I remember him," he whispered. Lily smiled with quiet relief. Ethan carefully placed the photograph back into the box before lifting the cream-colored envelope. The paper felt surprisingly heavy despite containing only a single folded letter. He looked toward Lily for permission. She nodded without speaking. Ethan slowly unfolded the pages. The handwriting was careful and steady. "Dear Mr. Carter, if you are reading this letter, then my daughter found the courage to trust the promise I asked her to keep. First, thank you. Not because you gave me work, but because you always treated me with dignity. You probably never realized how much that mattered. Every morning you greeted me by name. Every Christmas you thanked every gardener, cleaner, and maintenance worker personally before leaving for your holiday. Small kindnesses are easy to forget when you give them, but impossible to forget when you receive them." Ethan felt his chest tighten as he continued reading. The words carried no request for money, no demand, and no expectation. They simply carried gratitude. Lily quietly watched his expression while snow continued drifting gently around the peaceful garden. Ethan realized that everything inside the wooden box had been carefully chosen years before this winter morning. The gloves represented faithful work. The seeds represented hope for tomorrow. The photograph preserved a forgotten memory. The letter preserved something even greater. It reminded him that the smallest acts of respect had quietly taken root in another person's life, growing into enough trust that, after everything else had been lost, one little girl had crossed an entire city believing that this house would still be the safest place her father could send her. The letter rested quietly in Ethan Carter's hands long after he finished reading the final sentence. The winter breeze carried a few delicate snowflakes across the garden, yet neither he nor Lily Harper moved from the weathered wooden bench beneath the great maple tree. It felt as though the entire garden had been waiting years for this moment to arrive. Ethan carefully folded the letter along its original creases before placing it gently back inside the cream-colored envelope. He looked toward Lily with eyes far softer than they had been only a few hours earlier. "Your father left behind something far more valuable than I ever realized," he said quietly. Lily smiled, her bright blue eyes reflecting both relief and gratitude. "He always believed people should leave kindness where other people expected only ordinary things." Ethan nodded slowly. Those simple words echoed through his thoughts as he looked across the sleeping flower beds hidden beneath fresh snow. He suddenly noticed details that had escaped his attention for years. The carefully shaped stone borders. The winding paths that invited people to slow down instead of hurry through. The handmade wooden signs carrying messages of hope. None of them had appeared by accident. They had all been planted with intention by a man whose greatest success would never appear on a balance sheet. Ethan stood and walked toward one of the empty garden beds near the maple tree. He knelt and gently brushed away a thin layer of snow until dark soil appeared beneath his gloved hands. "Are these the places where your father wanted the seeds planted?" he asked. Lily carried the wooden box over to him and carefully untied the small paper packets. "Yes," she answered. "He said flowers should always return in the spring, even if the person who planted them cannot see them bloom." Ethan opened the packet labeled white lilies and carefully poured several tiny seeds into Lily's mittened hand. Together they pressed the seeds gently into the waiting soil before covering them again with care. They repeated the process with the blue hydrangeas and finally with the packet marked Hope Garden. Neither of them spoke very much. They did not need to. Every handful of soil, every careful movement, and every quiet smile became its own conversation. When the final seeds had been planted, Ethan removed his gloves and picked up the worn leather gardening gloves that had belonged to Lily's father. He held them with deep respect before placing them back inside the wooden box. "These belong here," he said softly. "They remind us who first cared for this place." Lily closed the lid carefully but did not lock it again. Dad said boxes are only meant to stay closed until people trust each other. Ethan smiled warmly. Then I think he was right. As they slowly walked back toward the house, Ethan glanced once more across the peaceful garden. For years he had measured success by expanding companies, closing negotiations, and building larger opportunities. Yet standing beside one little girl on a snowy winter afternoon, he realized that the greatest investment he could ever make was not measured in dollars or square feet. It was measured in people, in promises kept, and in the quiet decision to care before being asked. When they stepped inside the warm house once again, Ethan looked at the wooden box resting safely in Lily's hands and made a silent promise of his own. Whatever tomorrow might bring, the garden would never again be forgotten, the memory of her father would never again fade into silence, and Lily would never have to wonder whether she faced the future alone, because from that day forward she had found not only the home her father trusted, but also the friend he had always believed would open the door. Several weeks passed, and winter slowly began giving way to the first gentle signs of spring. Small patches of green appeared beneath melting snow, and the quiet garden behind Ethan Carter's townhouse seemed to awaken a little more each morning. What had started as an unexpected meeting on a frozen doorstep gradually became part of a new daily rhythm. Before leaving for Brooks' Capital each morning, Ethan always walked through the garden with Lily Harper whenever she visited after school. They checked the flower beds together, brushed fallen twigs from the stone paths, and paused beneath the old maple tree where everything had quietly begun. The weathered wooden bench had become their favorite place to sit, while the carved wooden box rested safely inside Ethan's study whenever it was not in Lily's hands. One Monday morning, however, the peaceful routine met its first real challenge. Ethan arrived at the executive boardroom overlooking downtown Boston, where members of the company's leadership team were already reviewing architectural plans spread across the polished conference table. Large presentation screens displayed a proposal for expanding the headquarters by purchasing the neighboring property located directly behind Ethan's townhouse. The project promised impressive financial returns, additional executive facilities, and stronger long-term investment opportunities. One of the senior executives pointed toward a digital rendering of the future development. The only significant obstacle is the existing private garden, he explained professionally. Removing it would allow us to maximize the available land and improve the overall value of the project. Ethan quietly studied the image without speaking. On the screen, the beautiful garden had disappeared completely, replaced by concrete walkways, parking areas, and a modern conference building. The familiar maple tree no longer existed. Neither did the weathered wooden bench, the stone fountain, or the flower beds where Lily and her father had planted hope long before anyone noticed. Another executive smiled confidently. The garden has sentimental value, but from a business perspective it serves no practical purpose. Those words settled heavily across the room. Only a few weeks earlier, Ethan might have accepted the recommendation without hesitation. Instead, he slowly closed the proposal folder resting before him. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes before speaking calmly. "Tell me something," he said. "How many people helped build this company long before most of us entered this room?" Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. No one answered immediately. Ethan continued in the same measured voice. "We celebrate quarterly growth, successful negotiations, and remarkable investments. But how often do we remember the people whose quiet dedication created the foundation beneath every achievement?" The room remained silent. Ethan reached into his briefcase and carefully removed the cream-colored envelope from the wooden box. He did not open the letter. He simply rested it gently beside the proposal documents. "This letter reminds me that true value cannot always be measured on financial reports," he said. "Sometimes the greatest return comes from protecting something that teaches people who they are." He slid the expansion proposal back across the table. "The garden stays." A director politely asked whether an alternative plan could still meet the company's financial goals. Ethan nodded with quiet confidence. Then we will create one. That afternoon, instead of approving demolition, Ethan assembled architects, landscape designers, and engineers to redesign the project around the existing garden rather than replacing it. When he returned home that evening, Lily was already sitting beneath the maple tree with the weathered wooden box beside her. She looked up as Ethan approached and noticed the peaceful smile on his face. "Something good happened today," she said. Ethan sat beside her on the familiar bench and looked across the garden where tiny green shoots had just begun pushing through the warming soil. "Yes," he answered softly. "Today your father protected this garden one more time." Spring arrived quietly, almost as though the garden had decided to reward every promise that had been kept throughout the long winter. Fresh green leaves unfolded across the branches of the great maple tree, the stone paths shimmered after gentle morning rain, and the flower beds that Ethan Carter and Lily Harper had carefully planted together began showing the first signs of life. Tiny shoots pushed through the dark soil exactly where the small paper packets from the weathered wooden box had been opened months before. Every new blossom seemed to carry a memory forward instead of leaving it behind. Ethan found himself spending more time in the garden than inside his office whenever he returned home. The peaceful routine gradually became part of his life. Some evenings he watered the young plants while Lily read library books aloud from the weathered wooden bench. Other afternoons they quietly replaced old wooden markers with new ones carved by hand, preserving every message that Lily's father had once left throughout the garden. Ethan insisted that the original words remain exactly the same. Hope grows quietly. Kindness needs daily care. Leave beauty behind you. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited several senior executives, architects, and department managers to visit the property before construction on the redesigned headquarters expansion officially began. Most of them expected another routine planning session. Instead, Ethan guided them slowly through the winding garden paths without discussing budgets, schedules, or engineering drawings. He stopped beneath the maple tree and introduced Lily with genuine pride. She stood beside the weathered wooden bench holding the familiar wooden box while smiling politely at every visitor. Ethan then shared the story of the gardener who had built the bench, planted the tree, carved every wooden marker, and quietly transformed a piece of land into a place where strangers could rediscover peace. No one interrupted him. When he finished speaking, the executives looked around the garden differently than when they had first arrived. They no longer saw unused property waiting for development. They saw a legacy created through patience, dignity, and ordinary acts of kindness. During the following weeks, the redesigned project moved forward exactly as Ethan had promised. The new office building curved respectfully around the existing garden instead of replacing it. Wide walking paths connected employees directly to the peaceful space during breaks. Benches were added for reflection, native flowers surrounded the original planting beds, and every mature tree remained protected. Near the entrance, Ethan commissioned a simple bronze plaque that read, "This garden reminds us that every lasting achievement begins with someone who quietly cared before anyone noticed." Beside the plaque stood another smaller marker carrying the gardener's name so future generations would understand who first planted the seeds of both beauty and compassion. Ethan also established the Harper Garden Scholarship, providing yearly educational opportunities for children who dreamed of studying horticulture, environmental science, or landscape design. When he explained the scholarship during the company gathering, he looked toward Lily standing proudly beneath the maple tree. "This is not only about honoring one remarkable man," he said. "It is about believing that gentle hands can change the future just as surely as powerful ones." Warm applause filled the garden while sunlight filtered gently through the growing branches overhead. Lily looked down at the weathered wooden box resting safely in her hands before quietly placing it upon the familiar bench. She no longer carried it everywhere because its purpose had already begun reaching beyond the carved wood. The promise her father entrusted to her had become something larger than a single letter or a handful of seeds. It had grown into a place where countless people would one day slow their hurried steps, breathe deeply, remember what truly mattered, and discover that the strongest foundations are often built by those whose names are spoken with gratitude rather than fame. 1 year later, the garden no longer looked like a quiet corner hidden behind an elegant townhouse. It had become a place where people naturally slowed their steps, smiled at strangers, and remembered that even the busiest lives deserved moments of peace. Every spring morning, sunlight filtered gently through the broad branches of the maple tree, casting dancing patterns across the winding stone paths that Lily Harper's father had once cared for with patient hands. The white lilies had bloomed exactly where Ethan Carter and Lily planted them together beneath the melting snow. Nearby, the blue hydrangeas had grown into vibrant clusters that surrounded the weathered wooden bench with quiet beauty. The small wooden markers remained exactly where they had always been, their simple messages now read by employees, neighbors, children, and visitors who often paused to reflect before continuing their day. Ethan walked through the garden almost every morning before going to the office. He no longer carried only a briefcase. Tucked safely inside was the cream-colored letter, protected within a leather folder that reminded him daily of the promise hidden inside ordinary kindness. Every time he greeted the gardeners, maintenance staff, receptionists, and security officers by name, he remembered the words written by Lily's father. Small kindnesses are easy to forget when you give them, but impossible to forget when you receive them. Those words quietly became part of the company's culture. Managers listened more carefully. Leaders thanked people more often. Employees began leaving handwritten notes of appreciation for one another on a community board placed beside the garden entrance. No one had been instructed to do it. Kindness simply continued growing where it had been planted. On a warm Saturday morning, Lily arrived carrying the weathered wooden box once again. She was smiling as she walked beneath the familiar maple tree, her faded backpack now carefully repaired with new stitching instead of replacing it with something newer. Ethan was already waiting beside the old wooden bench with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, just as he had prepared on the first winter morning they met. Lily placed the wooden box gently on the bench before opening it one final time. The leather gardening gloves rested beside the photograph exactly as before. The seed packets were now empty, their purpose fulfilled. The letter remained carefully folded inside its envelope. Lily looked toward Ethan and smiled. Dad used to say that some promises are meant to stay with us forever. Ethan nodded. Before carefully placing one fresh white lily blossom inside the box beside the letter. Now every season will be part of his story, he said softly. Together they closed the carved lid without locking it. There was no longer any need for keys because nothing inside needed to be hidden anymore. The greatest gift the box had carried had already been shared. As they stood beneath the maple tree, children from the Harper Garden Scholarship Program began arriving for their first weekend planting workshop. They laughed together while learning how to prepare soil, water young plants, and care for living things with patience instead of hurry. Lily watched them with quiet happiness before turning toward Ethan. I think Dad would have loved this. Ethan looked across the garden where flowers, trees, memories, and new beginnings now existed side by side. I believe he already does, he replied. The gentle breeze carried the fragrance of blooming lilies through the warm spring air while sunlight illuminated the garden that almost disappeared forever. Ethan realized that the greatest fortune he had ever protected was never found inside a company, a contract, or a bank account. It was found on a cold winter morning when he chose to open his front door, listen to one little girl, and trust that the smallest seed of compassion could grow into a legacy that would continue blooming long after both of them had walked beyond the garden paths together.